dugsiga boardingka iyo maalinlaha ah ee Amano Boarding and Day School.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? I hope you are doing well at home and you are very safe. Today we have a science lesson. As you remember, last week we had science on the same day. That's a Tuesday. We did about safety in food storage. We listed some of the items that we use to store food. I hope you remember them, but I can remind you, we talked about the fridge, the sack, the containers, the hot pots, the shelves, and the rest. We did all that in last lesson. Today's lesson is about the reasons for proper food storage, why we should store food at our homes. But before we go to our subtopic, I'd like us to observe the following pictures, and you see the difference, or you see, you compare those pictures. The first picture, yes, we have the two pictures there. The first picture, you can see this food is put on the table and it's rotten. The second picture, you can see the shelves and foods are put in the containers. From here you can know that this food, the way it was stored, it was not the correct way. That's why these foods, they have rotten. The second picture, we can see the shelves. Foods are put in the containers, which means that these foods will take long and they'll not rot very fast. The next set of pictures we have here, that one, and the other picture. The first picture, we can see food was left in the plates, or food was put in the plates and left there. The second picture, we see food that is put in the container and the container is covered. That means if food is not well stored, the flies, they come and they contaminate that food, like the first picture. The second picture, food is put in the container and it's covered, which means this food is safe for eating. It will not be contaminated because the container is covered. Flies cannot get in the container. Unlike the first picture, where we see flies are on the food, they are contaminating that food, and if you eat this food, then you'll get sick because that food is contaminated. So now we can go to today's work on the reasons as to why we should store food. Why we should store food well at home. The reasons as to why we store food are, first one, we store food properly for the following reasons to prevent it from going bad. From the pictures we saw, the food that is left on the table, that food got contaminated and it gets bad very fast. And as you know, the food that is rotten, we should not eat. The next reason is we keep food, or we store food to preserve, to eat it later. If you have plenty of food that you cannot eat and finish, that food you store it so that you can eat it later. Later means maybe tomorrow or another time. The next one is to avoid contamination from the dirt. This means that food that is well stored, it cannot get contaminated from the dirt or the flies. But food that is not well kept or stored, it will get contaminated very fast as we refer to the pictures that we saw the previous from the previous video. So we have next one is to prevent the pests infestation. That means some pests like the cockroach, the flies, they eat the food that we leave on the table or the food that we don't store well. So we should store food well so that the pests cannot contaminate and eat that food. The next is to avoid wastage. After eating food, any food that remains should be stored or kept well for use for another time. But if we don't store, it means that that food will be thrown away. And when you throw food, that is food wastage. Food remains should be kept well and to be eaten the later time. Now, this part we have, if you keep cooked food and uncooked food together, the uncooked food will contaminate the food. That means we should store food in separate containers. Food that is cooked should be stored in, from a different container, and another food that is not cooked should be stored in a different container. Harvested beans from the farm should be dried in the sun. After drying those seeds in the sun, then we store those bean seeds in the sack. Cooked beans should be packed in containers, then stored in the fridge. From this we are learning that cooked food should be stored in a different way from uncooked food. For example, we have seen beans that are not cooked, they are dried in the sun and stored in the sack. But beans that are cooked, they are packed in the containers. After that, they are stored in the fridge. So we can see beans can be stored. Beans can be stored in the fridge or in the sack. The ones that are stored in a sack, they are dried, or the beans that are dry. And those ones that are cooked, they should be stored in the fridge. They are stored in different ways. Also, we should make sure that cooked food are not mixed with uncooked food when we are storing them. We should separate. The cooked food should be stored in the containers, then put in the fridge. Uncooked food, for example rice, should be put in like the sack. The cooked food can be stored in the fridge. So we should be able to differentiate between those two ways of storing the food. We go to the next one. We have stored food should be kept away from the pests. Now let's look at this exercise we have here. Number 1, name 2 reasons for proper food storage. From what we have learned, we saw several ways in which why we store food, and we said one reason as to why we store food is to avoid wastage. That one we learned from the other. That's avoid wastage. That means if we store food, then we are able to use that food at a later time. That is one of the reasons. But I'll not give you the 2 reasons. I'll only give you one, and you'll be able to get another reason because that is part of your exercise. So I'd like to thank you so much for today's lesson about reasons as to why we store food. You try to do this exercise, just one question on the reason as to why we store food. We have looked at 5 reasons as to why we store food. We looked at different ways of storing food and the items that are used to store food. We learned that in last lesson. So thank you so much for today's lesson. Please watch this video and then answer those questions that are displayed there. Thank you, and meet you next lesson.